Hello, I'm Dan McKay with Implementation Specialists, and today we're going to be talking about getting started with pivot tables. What I'm going to do is go through a set of slides and also the slide deck from the Pivot Table Lab from the year before last GPUC. I want to say last year's GPUC, which is in November, but we're in January. So the year prior, we did a Pivot Table Lab, which was well received. We did not do that this year, but due to some feedback, I thought we would do a webinar and go over that again for people who would like to see more about starting out with pivot tables. So before I get started here, if you have any questions, please go ahead and press the raise your hand, and we'll cover questions at the end, and I'll stop along the way to see if there are questions as well. So we'll get started here. I'll bring up some slides. So, like I said, I'm going to be switching between two slide decks and a Excel spreadsheet. You should be able to see my screen now, which is probably kind of messy looking, but we'll get going here. So I've called it Excel Pivot Tables 101. And with this, we'll get started here. Just doing a little maintenance on the webinar itself. So in our agenda, we'll talk about what pivot tables do and what they don't do. So really, what are they best suited for? What kind of format should my data be in? Selecting the table, then creating the pivot table, and configuring a table, configuring the fields, and some nice features, slicers and timelines. So here we go. Also, I was going to mention you can add things to the chat window, and I will catch it as well. So for pivot tables, what the purpose of a pivot table is to answer questions like how much, how many, how much meaning I need a dollar amount, I need a total quantity, how many would be a count of how many items did we sell. And then the term slice and dice is often used with pivot tables, and you'll see why. With a pivot table, you create a table of columns and rows to summarize the data based on those columns and rows in that format. You can filter out unwanted data, and there are many, many options for changing the design of how it looks. For when you go to present it, when you go to print it, if you're not just using it for yourself on the screen. So you have pretty reports that can come out of it. Oh, I see we can't see the screen. I am going to show the screen. All right. I will back up and thank you. Thank you. So here we go. So we'll go back to this. This is my pivot table slide here with what we're going to cover and some of the things that we're going to, some of the questions we're going to answer using the pivot table. So data. Typically, when you're dealing with Excel, your data is in columns. And for pivot tables, your column headers need to be unique. Pivot table can be in a different Excel sheet than the data, and often is. And also, you can read directly from a database. And something you can also do is you can combine multiple data sources on a single pivot table and bring them together, sort of like joining SQL tables. It's an advanced feature that you can do. Sample data. So this is the sample data we're going to use today. Is something I put together so we kind of can all be on the same page. This is random real estate data. It's not based on reality for anything. It's just simple real estate data. I have a date of the sale. I have agents and regions, house style, number of bedrooms, and price. I'll give you a peek at that right now. So here's the data we're going to be working with. So you can see here, I have the date of the sale, the name of the agent, the region of the city or area, the style of the house, condo, Tudor, colonial, ranch, and how many bedrooms and what the price was. Maybe the price sounds low or high to you. It's just for demonstration purposes today. Okay. So if my columns are set up side by side, I can simply just select the column headers and create a pivot table. So we're going to create a pivot table and show you how that gets started. So in this case, I have my column headers, I have my data, and yes, I have a few hundred rows, or 151 rows with headers. But rather than select the exact data, I'm just going to select the columns. The empty columns below are basically ignored in the pivot table. So here we do Insert and Pivot Table. So from the Insert menu, we pick Pivot Table. We've selected the data, and we get this window like we saw in the slide deck. Here is my table range. From here, if I had actually missed a column, I can adjust it here. I can go back and reselect them. And if I was choosing external data source, then I can go and point at a SQL Server or other kind of data source that I have already set up, and it's visible to the spreadsheet. In this case, I've got the data in the spreadsheet. And where do we want to place the pivot table? I generally use a new worksheet. You can put it in an existing worksheet at a specific location that doesn't give you a lot of room. And here's a tip on that. Pivot tables need to be able to grow. And they will not insert new rows when they grow. They overwrite existing data. So that's why I always pick a new worksheet if possible, because the pivot table will give you a warning before it overwrites existing data, but I like to give it lots of room to grow. Adding this data to the data model, we'll get back to that at the end, and that is how you specify multiple data sources. We're going to just take this and go with the most simple option. So you notice I didn't have to select anything. It just came up with this. It says I didn't have to select anything in this window other than OK. So here is my pivot table. You don't see much, do you? So let's go back to the slide deck. So this is what we just covered. And here's where we are. We have the pivot table field wizard. Notice that the fields that I have selected are here at the top of the wizard on the top right. And I have the 4 sections of the pivot table: the filters, the columns, the rows, and the values. And some instructions here on the left side. Let's go over what these sections mean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up there and drag fields into whichever area that I think they belong. So filters, they go across all the data in the table. So if I want to filter out a specific region of the city, I can drag the region to the filters. Any hierarchy that I have in the data analysis that I wish to do, I need to put that hierarchy in the rows. The columns should be kept to as few of the entries as possible because it automatically creates all combinations. I will show you that. It's very messy, very fast. And the values, this is what I'm trying to find? What am I summing up? What am I counting? So let's go back to the spreadsheet. So in this case, we're going to do a simple sales by agent. We do not actually have to have filters, and we don't have to have columns. Here's the agent and the price. Now notice, we'll go to the next slide on this. Notice I'll point out two things. One is the count of the price. And two, it includes blanks. It's including blanks because we selected the entire column, and there are blanks in there. To get rid of the blanks, we'll just deselect them. Uncheck them. We don't have blanks. And yes, we had 150 rows. This grand total tells me that. But why is it showing count? It's showing count because that's how it gets started. Oops, excuse me, I'm on the wrong item here. It doesn't always, but it often defaults to count for the values. So we're going to change that to sum. It's an annoyance and something that trips up a lot of people when they first start with this. Trips up people who've used it for a long time. So notice, I'll go back over this again. Make sure you see this. Count of price down here in the bottom right corner. There is a drop-down arrow, and you see it says Value Field Settings. Value Field Settings, I'm going to change it to Sum. And at this point, I can change the column name while I'm at it. There are my dollars sold by agent. I want to go back. I want to change these formats. So here's a tip. Don't change the formats directly in the pivot table using the normal way you would do it, because when the pivot table refreshes, it overwrites them. Your best way to do it is to set it up in the value field settings. So another way to get to the value field settings is to right-click on the values and pick value field settings. And then we're going to go into the number format in here and pick currency. I don't need any decimal places, but I would like to see some dollar signs and some commas. So there are my dollar signs and commas, and notice it went all the way down into the grand total. So this is a quick, simple pivot table to show dollars by agent. But now, I really want to do some slicing and dicing. I want to know dollars by agent by region. So the way I do that is I drag the region into the columns. Now notice my columns show up, and I believe by default they're alphabetical order. And you see it split out the sums. I still have the same total, but it shows me how much was sold in each region by each agent. So now it's getting more interesting. Now, as I said, I will show you what happens when you add lots of things to columns. If I add more items to the columns, you see now I've got styles by region. And if I throw in bedrooms in there, suddenly the thing is getting out of control. Notice this isn't exactly the way I want to see this. This is why I say put the hierarchy into the rows. So this also helps me answer the questions that I've formulated. So I want to know, do I want to know agents by region, or do I want to know regions by agent? In this case, I can look at it either way. If I want to look at style by agent or agents by style, it depends on where I drag into the hierarchy. So notice I'm going to grab style here, and I'm going to drag it into the rows. I can put it above agents or below agents. If I put it above agents, then I have agents by style. So now I can see Anne sold $180,000 worth of colonials in Westgate. If my question really is styles by agent, I can move agent above styles in the rows, and now I can see for each agent the styles they sold and in which region. Any questions on this so far? Let me pull up the dashboard here and see if anyone has any hands up or any chats. Okay. Okay. Don't have any questions yet. Thank you very much for the pause here. We'll go back into this. We'll go back to the slide deck and get to the next topic here. So as we covered here, changing it from count of to sum of. Notice also, I didn't cover this. There, you notice that there was average, min, max, product, and count of numbers. And this is where you'd set the number format. I will go in and show you this other part where these different items you can pick, and also the Show Values tab. Just for show you some of the other capabilities here. I'm going to pull this style back out. Notice that to remove something, you just drag it back, takes it out. If I want to know average selling price, I can do an average. So here's my average sales for these agents by these regions. Doesn't tell me then I can have an average if I only sold one house, or if the agent sold 10 houses. The average doesn't let me know that. But if I was looking for average price, this is how I would go about it. What is the most? With max, I can go and see what is the biggest, what is the most expensive house sold in that region by that agent, or what is the least expensive house. And as we started with the count, how many houses did each agent sell in that area? Now notice I have it formatted with dollar signs, but we can see what the values are. So of the 150 homes sold, we can see who sold the most in which area, or how many in each area. But this brings up another question. What if I want to see the count and the sum? So the way we would do that is you can drag the same field into the values again. So now we're going to add count. And notice it defaulted to count, so this time that was nice. Let's see, properties. And so here we can see 710,000 on 4 properties, 1.28 mil on 6 properties. And as I mentioned, there's another tab in the value field settings called Show Values As. In here, for some advanced capabilities, once you get pivot tables under your belt and you're really comfortable with them, you can come in and do calculations based on differences, running totals, percentages of grand totals, and rankings, and things of that nature. We're not going to cover those today. We're going to cover some more basics here. So as you noticed, as the wizard is filled in, the table is created. I drag sections around. We're going to go back in and look at some filters, some dates, and slicers. So now as we have our sales here by region, what if I really wanted to see sales by date? So I have the date of the sale, and I drag this date in here, and we want to know dollars for this. We'll set it back to dollars here. As you notice, as I drag things in and out of there, it resets it back to the default, so I have to go back in and change it again. But here we can see that since our date field, go back and look at the data, our date field is set on the actual day. And here with this random data, I have 12/13, 12/14. But what if I don't really want to see it by day? What if I really want to see it by month or period or quarter? Well, there are two ways to do that. There's a hard way, which is the way it used to have to be. So I would have to add another column and go calculate the month, go calculate the quarter. So if I said the month, I could say I'm going to get a numeric month. So if I didn't want a numeric month and I really wanted a spelled out, then I have to do additional formula to say pick the month and spell it out, or I can format the date. I can try to format the date over here as a month, but it's still going to show me. So if I go back and show you this, before we add that, if someone were to mention, hey, why don't we just set it up to be a month? Might not work the way we want it to work that way. Well, let's say I have it like this. Come into my sheet and I refresh the data. It doesn't do me any good because that's only the way it looks. If I come back in and I do this month, I've added this column. Now let's say I know, okay, 1 is January, 5 is May. We'll go with that. I can come back to the pivot table. Notice the new menu items at the top on the ribbon. I have Analyze and Design. In Analyze, I'm going to change my data source and add column G to include the month. Notice month shows up here. I'm going to take date out of here and add month in. Now I can see my sales by month. That's kind of the hard way to do it. I told you there was an easier way, and I'll show you how to do that. So here we do have it by month. Indeed, we do. I'm going to put the date back on here. And back up on Analyze, you'll see Insert Timeline. We can do timelines and slicers, and we'll cover both of those. When you hit Insert Timelines, you'll notice it comes up and says Date right here. So what it does is it looks at my pivot table and it says, what are the date fields that are in there? It finds this one called Date. Now suddenly I have a date slicer. Now what I can do with this date slicer is I don't need the date in the columns anymore. I already have it. I can go back to my region like I had before, and if I want to know sales by region by a specific date, I can move the dates into this timeline. So now here I can look at months, years, quarters, and days. So I want to look at a specific month. Remember, the data is in 2017. Uh-oh, my mouse is giving me trouble here. Excuse me for a second. I can just click on that particular month, and there are my sales for June of 2017. I can also look at it in quarters, and I can pick quarter 2 of 2017. Go back to months. Notice in the timeline, I can drag the month ranges to cover whichever months I want to look at. I want to look at individual months. Here are my sales in January. If I want to compare that, I have 2.59 million. If I want to compare that to December, you see much better sales in December, possibly for tax reasons. If I look at years, in this case, I only have 2017 data. I don't have anything for anything else. And I can go back to individual days. It's a very long timeline then. So with this, I have lots of options, and I don't have to deal with the dates right directly on the pivot table. So let's go back and look at some filters and slicers. So filters and slicers, let's suppose I want to look at a specific region. I really only care about, say, Northport for right now. This is my analysis. I have a couple ways to do that. One way, I can come in here and pick just Northport. There's my Northport values. And at this point, since I have a timeline, I can come in and look at it month by month. And see November didn't look so good in Northport. Not near as nice as December. So that's one way I can do that. Another way I can do this is well, one more thing to point out is I can pick out two, do it however I want with that, or I can move the region into the filters. So the filters apply across all the data. So when I open the filters, it does somewhat the same thing. If I'm picking one at a time, I can pick two at a time. Notice now when I pick two at a time, they're combined into one column, where when I had them as columns, I would see the two columns. This is one. There's an advantage either way. So with the filters, I can have multiple filters. If I wanted to throw a style in there and say, I really want to look at, my questions are sales in Northport, but in particular, I want to look at modern style homes in Northport, and we want to look for specific years or specific dates, we can see that like this. A little bit cumbersome, but it's this way pivot tables worked from the start. Now we'll go and show you the difference between a filter and a slicer. So put it back the way this was, and we're going to go up to the Analyze table and insert a slicer. And what a slicer is just the filter, but done in a user interface. And I can use it in conjunction with the columns. So if I was really looking at style, I want to pick style here. Here's my slicer for the style. And if I have my regions as the columns, and I select all of them, I can use the slicers to pick specific types. I can hold the control key down and pick combinations. And so with the slicer and the timeline, I can, with my mouse and relatively quickly, change my analysis and answer different questions. And speaking of questions, we'll see if anyone has any questions here. I don't see any questions or any hands up just yet. Okay. Back to some more demos. To remove the slicer, to remove the timeline, you can see there is a remove button in the top right corner. I'm going to remove some of these right now. I'm going to go back to, well, that reset it, pardon, delete button. We're back to the basic pivot table. So here are all the sales for the whole year for these regions. Another item here that's rather useful is when I look at these numbers, I can see Ann had $710,000 in sales in East Village. And unless I drag in a lot of other columns, I can't really see the data behind it. What pivot tables have is a drill back feature. If you double click on any number in the pivot table, it will give you the data that makes up that number in a new sheet. The sheet is static. So here I double clicked on and sales in East Village, and it created a new sheet called Sheet 2. This data is static, independent of or disconnected from the pivot table. As I can see, these 4 items, these 4 sales make up that total. So I have one in December, January, February, and March. And in the East Village, these types of homes, notice it gives all of the columns of the data that's being used in the pivot table, regardless if they're used in any filters or any of the rows or columns in the pivot table itself. Once you've looked at this data, it just stays there. The way to get rid of it is to right-click on the tab and hit delete. It'll tell you you're deleting a sheet and you can't undo it. But if you drill back to a lot of these, you will have a lot of numbered sheets that have that data, including you can do the grand total and see there is effectively my entire data set as it goes into the pivot table. I'll delete that one. So that's how to see the data behind any cell in the pivot table. Any cell that you're summing or counting, things of that nature. So I'm going to go back and look at some hierarchy items here and show we can put in several items of hierarchy and how we can do subtotals and that make up the grand total. So as I had covered in here, the pivot table is really to answer questions. And the more you use the pivot tables, the more you can formulate the questions to say, what am I looking for? Am I looking for, I want to know what kind of houses are selling, or what are they selling? Which agent is selling better in which region? Or is there a specific type of house or the number of bedrooms? So we can start to move things into the columns, look at the number of bedrooms, and see how the sales are going, number of bedrooms. We can look at sales, or go back to count if we want. Oh, excuse me. And we can look at agent, region, and style. And as you notice, as I said, the hierarchy, it is automatic when I drop them into the rows. And you will see, I can see the hierarchy here. They're spaced over. See Anne, her sales by house type in East Village, and the number of bedrooms across the top. I can collapse these items. I can collapse individual agents. I can also, with the row labels, I can select specific agents to compare. If I wanted to see Anne's sales versus Denise's sales, I can do that this way. And I can collapse these to see it at a less detailed level. And then if I see specific information, like I want to open up and look at, say, Westgate and compare those, I can see this by just expanding it. Now, if we wanted subtotals, to do subtotals, we simply right-click and we add a subtotal. Now, notice we have a subtotal for it. There's my subtotal. The subtotal is on the top. There isn't a subtotal, obviously, on here, on the style, because it's an individual item. And we are subtotaling by agent as well. To remove the subtotal, just take it off. There's no subtotal now by region. Grand totals work the same way. Grand totals themselves come in the pivot table options. So if I right-click on the pivot table anywhere, I will see an item called Pivot Table Options in the menu. in here, we have layout and format, some options for empty cells. Some people want to see zeros in there, some do not. So in this case, I add a 0 for empty cells. Now I've got 0 values. That's, if you want a cleaner look, I don't put that in there. Totals and filters. Do I want to see grand totals for rows and or columns? So if I shut off my row columns, or in this case my column totals, I still see sales for and grand total sales, but I don't necessarily need to see 2-bedroom totals versus 3-bedroom totals. Back into pivot table options. We also see some other options for displaying, for layout, showing the values row, the sort orders, what rows get repeated on printing, whether I save the source data with a file or not. This has to do with whether when I'm pointing at a database outside of Excel, when I save the file, does it have the data in it or not? If I have sensitive data, I may not want to do that. I may want to uncheck that, and then it just saves the definition of the pivot table without the data in it until I actually connect up and open it again. Whether or not I refresh the data when opening the file, and some alternate text. Some of these I've actually never used, never found a use for them, but they're here. I heard a beep. I'm going to check to see if there's a question. I don't see any questions. So this brings up one other thing with a refresh. Here is my data. Should my data change, and I've made changes in my data, it will not reflect into the pivot table until the pivot table itself is refreshed. So in the pivot table, it has its own copy of the data until I right-click and hit refresh. At that point, it reads the data. So if we go in and change one of these items to be $1.2 million for Ian and Westgate in May, and I look in here for Ian in Westgate, and just to make sure we're looking at May, let's throw in a timeline again, and we'll go into months. In May, I don't see a 1.2 million. You notice it's 210,000. Here's my data. It will not show there until I right-click and hit refresh. Then it brings it in, and now I see the 1.2 million. So if your data is changing, if you're doing calculations, bringing in data, importing data, and then you go over and look in your pivot table, make sure you're refreshing the pivot table to have the most recent data. Or if you bring in data and you want to take a look at what data it was and maybe print it, then you want to be aware of when it is refreshed. So I put the data back. Now back to 210,000 in my sheet. Right-click, refresh, back to 210,000. Go back to selecting everything except blanks. Other options for pivot tables. When you have your pivot table selected, notice the two new ribbons added. Analyze, where we did the slicers and timelines. We changed the data source. You can do a refresh here. You can move a pivot table to another item, and a lot of the options that you get by right-clicking and doing pivot table options, you can also get to from up here. You can do field settings for actual fields, and notice that it follows the field when I click on it. There's a style, there's a region, there's an agent, and I can go into the field settings for the agents. In the design, we have whether I'm going to do row headers and banded columns, banded rows. I can change the colors of the rows. Notice I can just click in these pivot table styles and use these checkboxes. Makes it pretty quick to take something that I've analyzed and get it ready to create a report. I can do some different report layouts. And what am I going to do with blank rows, or whether I want to insert a blank row after each item. So I can put some spaces in for readability. Grand totals, I can turn them on and off from here rather than go into the pivot table options, and same with subtotals. So as we notice here, I can change the looks of the pivot table. And with the report layout, I can have outline form, which adds more columns, or we can go back to compact form, which is keeps all of the hierarchy in a single column. So to go back over that, when I change the report layout to outline form, notice each level of the hierarchy that I've defined is in its own column. So here I have my agents, here I have my regions, here I have my styles. Let me take off this banded rows to make it a little more readable here. And there's a tabular format as well. Whatever you want to use to make your report look right, you do the settings up here in the design ribbon. And typically, when I'm doing analysis, I'm generally using the compact form for readability for my purposes. But then if I'm going to print it and hand it out to people, then I'm going to go look for a nice report. Another tip, when you want to adjust the pivot table, notice this wizard comes on and off when I click on the pivot table itself. That's configurable, but it defaults to being on. This checkbox at the bottom here, Defer Layout Update, means I can do my rearranging of my filters and columns and values and rows without seeing it happen in real time. And when I'm done, I can hit the Update button and have it update. Okay, I think I have covered everything that I wanted to cover for today's intro to pivot tables. I'm going to open the floor to questions. So if you have a question, you can type it into the questions window, or you can raise your hand, or you can take yourself off of mute. And I will unmute everyone. So if you don't want to be unmuted, please go back in and mute yourself. And if you have any questions, so I'll put up the last slide here. You can see my email on the slide. If you have any questions in the future, you can call or email at that address. I'll be happy to help you out. Thank you for attending. This has been Pivot Tables 101. Thank you very much.